This episode contains outdated racist terms used in the original context. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the Fade to White podcast. I'm your host, Jill Sim, and I will explore corners of American history, both known and unknown, as I uncover the secret history of my family, who went from black to white, and from enslavement to freedom, as eyewitnesses to American history spanning over 200 years. In Season 1, we begin in the modern age, the discovery following my grandmother Ellen's death of my family's African American history. The discovery of being the great-granddaughter of Anita Hemmings, considered the first black graduate of elite women's college, Vassar, and the discovery that my family passed for white throughout the 20th century. Please join me on this personal journey of discovery into American class, race, and gender history. And thank you for listening. Last time on the Fade to White podcast, in part 1 of episode Early Groundwork, I discovered that my great-grandmother Anita Hemmings was the first African-American graduate of the elite all-women's college, Vassar, and that she passed as white during her entire time there. I also began my investigation into the lives of Anita's parents, who fled the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia after the Civil War, bound like many other ex-slaves for progressive northern city Boston, once known as the American Athens. And I explored underpinnings of eugenics, the 19th century pseudoscience centered around biological racial differences in human beings, which began with Walter Plecker, a white son of the Shenandoah Valley, whose destructive works in Virginia's Bureau of Vital Statistics would lay the groundwork for entrenched American racism into the 20th century. In this, the second part of Early Groundwork, I talk about why Boston was important to my family and the remarkable people they counted as friends, many former freedom seekers who sought sanctuary in Boston during the period the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, and became essential figures in resistance to it. I continued to search for Robert, but neither Neil Todd nor I could confidently locate him on the 1870 census. I very quickly was given to understand that before 1870, positively identifying African Americans in extant paper trails pertaining to the Old South would be challenging, because most people of African descent in the South were chattel property, and were also generally not given surnames due to their unfree status. To try and find enslaved family before 1870, I would have to find out who owned them and pray that those owners opted to record the names of their enslaved in some document, such as in the rare letter, or account ledger, in deeds or property transfers, or in wills. I had no idea who might have owned my relatives. I contacted the Historical Society in Rockingham County and came up empty trying to find Robert or Dora or other immediate Hemmings and Logan families at all in Harrisonburg or in Bridgewater. Certain free black families and individuals of Rockingham County were registered before 1870, but Anita's parents were not among these numbers. I had no luck finding any Hemmingses in general in the Harrisonburg vicinity during this period. I did spot a local black family whose surname was Hemmings, Hemmons, on the 1870 census, a possible alternate spelling of Hemmings, which would turn out to be true, as we'll see, but there was no Robert listed in the household, nor was there a Sarah Hemmings or Sarah Hemmons of the right age to be Robert's mother in Harrisonburg or in Rockingham County, living or dead. So I had to work with what I did have. Like the Boston birth record registry showing that my great-grandmother Anita Hemmings was born in Boston. Her name at birth was Annie Williamson Hemmings. Annie was apparently born at home, 5 Phillips Court in Beacon Hill, on June 8, 1872, 8 months following Dora's and Robert's October marriage in Virginia. This birth record also did not jibe with information my grandmother gave me, that her mother was born in the South to some Creole people. So I wondered, was it possible, given Anita was born 8 months after the wedding, and given a story I was told that Anita was taken north as a baby, that the family self-reported that the birth had occurred in Boston, but that she was possibly older than the June 1872 birth and born in the South? Because I didn't want to believe Grandma had misrepresented the truth deliberately. And I swear she told me her mother's mother was a Creole. I never saw Ellen as a fantasist or teller of tall tales, or as a liar. She could deflect, she could be vague, but for my part, she was someone who told the truth, and I could trust in that. Maybe my memory of what she said was to blame, my own conflation. Probably. So I would have to go by the paper trail data over human memory, and trust that Anita Hemmings was born in Boston, following what the official registry said. As I didn't have any more knowledge about Dora's and Robert's Virginia beginnings, it was time to shift focus to Boston. After the Hemmingses arrived in town after a long journey from Virginia, they settled off Phillips Street. Phillips Street was not only close to landmarks of the Revolution, like Faneuil Hall, the State House, Boston Harbor, where the famous Tea Party took place, but was the hallowed ground in abolitionist history, a locus of Boston's Underground Railroad activity. The neighborhood was home to Black abolitionists and their sons and daughters, who became educated and worked as the early lawyers, doctors, politicians, educators, alongside domestics and skilled laborers who served the stately red brick townhomes and mansions of Beacon Hill's powerful white elite. The neighborhood the Hemmingses settled in was synonymous with the Black struggle for liberty and equality. Near the Hemmings home at 5 Phillips Court, and adjacent to the African Meeting House, stands the Museum of African American History, which is housed in the former building of the circa 1835 Abiel Smith School. The Abiel Smith School was once upon a time the sole designated, segregated, overcrowded, and underfunded public school for all of Boston's Black children. While Boston was the first American city to establish a public school, which was Boston Latin, in 1635, Boston's Black families would have to fight to pursue education in Boston's publics into the late 19th century, in the fullest understanding that the free education was one of the great pillars of American democracy, that education for the former enslaved was a, quote, legitimate fruit of freedom, close quote. The Smith School was closed following the push to integrate city schools during the 1840s and 1850s. Benjamin Roberts, a Black printer, spearheaded the charge. Roberts sued the Boston School Board after his daughter, Sarah, 5, was denied access to all white schools in their neighborhood and was then forced to walk great distances, passing no fewer than 5 white schools she was barred from attending on her way to Abiel Smith. It took 10 years before a bill was passed prohibiting school segregation, and longer still to fully integrate. The Hemmings family were part of a wave of ex-Virginians to Boston, and the Beacon Hill quarter they settled in was referred to as the home to Boston's best colored families, which made up around 2% of the city's overall Black population. The Southern migrant and free Northern families of the Revolutionary period and the families of former abolitionists were alternately referred to as the Old Guard of Black Boston, evoking a long history of the Black presence. As I considered the Hemmings' choice of Boston, I was prompted by a detail Grandma gave about her grandparents, that they made an arduous journey by wagon from the South, and that soon after the family arrived, Boston was burning. Between November 9 and 10, 1872, 65 acres of Boston's historic downtown were destroyed by fire, which started in a building on Summer Street. The smoldering rubble of the burned area in the American Athens was described as like the ruins of the original Athens. Grandma said that in Boston, there was a man named Patrick Raymond, who was the fire chief of Cambridge. She stated that Raymond changed the Boston Fire Department. He made improvements that saved many lives, and he made the department more efficient. I did wonder why she recalled a 19th century fire chief from Boston when she sometimes couldn't or wouldn't give straight answers to questions I had about direct family lines, or even supply the full names of close relatives. But she thought it was important I knew about this fire and this fireman from long ago. In retrospect, the Great Fire of '72 was a disruptive event for the family, newly arrived with their hopes and dreams at risk of turning into ash. I considered that the family had just escaped the war-ravaged Shenandoah Valley, which had also been laid to waste by fire during the war. Grandma did not see fit to mention that Patrick Raymond, 1831 to 1892, was the first black fire chief in all of America. The son of an escaped slave from Virginia, he was a newspaperman, a Civil War veteran, and a pastor of the African Meeting House during the period of intensified fugitive activity in Boston of the mid-century. The Raymond family, whose name I would see again and again in connection with the Hemmingses in Boston social columns, were well known around Cambridgeport for their success in real estate. Recalling Grandma's name-checking Patrick Raymond, who originally settled in Boston in the 1840s, made me suspect the Hemmingses already knew people in place to help them get launched, just as pharmacist Geedy had helped the Loves in New York City. This pre-existing network also compelled the Hemmings' decision to choose Boston over other cities with long-established African-American communities, like Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., or New York City. The Hemmingses knew about Boston's rich history of radical abolitionism, and long before the famous American civil rights struggle of the 1960s, our black family lived through one of their own in Boston. My history classes always characterized Boston as the cradle of American liberty, along with Philadelphia, both cities suspended in the amber of Revolutionary-era history. Boston was the American Athens, hallowed ground of revolution. What I didn't learn in school was that Boston was the most progressive of all Northern American cities for people of color escaping the South. For her promised freedoms and air of tolerance, the city attracted thousands of families like mine in the post-Civil War period. In 1865, the Boston black population stood at 2,348. By 1880, it grew to 5,873. I never learned about the rich history of the black presence in Boston, the spirit of Crispus Attucks, black Native American, who was the first martyr of our revolution and inspired the patriots who came after him. African Americans in the 18th and 19th century Boston, whether free sons and daughters of revolution or the freedom seekers forming an exodus out of slavery South, constituted a uniquely distinguished group of people who constantly and consistently resorted to resistance and pressure tactics and to legal measures. The country's first black lawyers and judges came out of Boston to insist on the basic citizenship rights under the great pillars of democracy: the right to vote, free speech exercised in free presses, and free education in the best and most rigorous public schools in the land. Boston in the decades leading up to the Civil War was uniquely identified with anti-slavery groups, and of a more radical bent at that. The grandfather of Boston's radicalized version of abolitionism was a man named David Walker. He was born in North Carolina in 1796 to an enslaved father and a free mother from whom he inherited his free status. David Walker went to Boston, where he produced an 1829 pamphlet with this lengthy title, Walker's Appeal, in 4 articles, together with a preamble to the colored citizens of the world, but in particular and very expressly to those of the United States of America. The appeal's philosophies were inspired by a succession of slave uprisings, which in turn had been directly inspired by the American and French revolutions. Walker's ideas were deeply influenced by Black military leader Toussaint Louverture, 1743 to 1803, and the revolution to upend French colonial power and abolish slavery in Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti. David Walker was inspired by an enslaved American blacksmith named Gabriel and his insurrection of 1800 in Richmond, Virginia, and a planned attack on the Virginia Capitol to include kidnapping and possibly assassinating then-Governor James Monroe. And he was inspired by a Black American carpenter named Denmark Vesey, who planned an 1822 revolt for Charleston, South Carolina. The latter two rebellions were foiled, but they influenced David Walker's militant stance when it came to Black resistance, freedom, and equality. The appeal was a response to America's unending greed for goods and wealth built on slavery, especially as America expanded her borders following the Louisiana Purchase. And after the invention of the cotton gin put a period to Revolutionary-era discussions on mass emancipation of Black people and powered an increase in cotton bale production, which relied on slave labor, from 400,000 bales during the War of 1812 period to 4 million bales on the eve of the Civil War. While David Walker ran a used clothing store, he distributed his appeal by mail and via seamen and riverboatmen who carried it to major slave market hubs like Charleston and Savannah, Georgia, and around the Gulf of Mexico to New Orleans. The appeal called for the immediate end of slavery and upon people to rise up against their condition wherever they were and to employ violence if necessary. The appeal, in turn, inspired slave uprisings following its publication, such as the most famous of American slave revolts, that of Nat Turner's of 1831, which took place in my great-great-grandparents' native Virginia and led to the killings of some 60 white people. The appeal was viewed as so incendiary and so dangerous, and not just because of the call to violent action, but because it refuted the most commonly accepted rationalization supporting slavery, that African Americans were designed to labor for white people and that they were happy doing it. It countered the myth that American slavery, or the Christianized form of it, was an improvement of the ancient system under so-called barbaric regimes of the past. I never heard of the appeal, because it was still a seditious piece of writing in the 70s and 80s, when founders were still being used to inculcate patriotism and nationalism into American schoolchildren like me. I didn't know that in his work, David Walker also called out the most famous of all the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, a famous man in history Grandma told me that our secret Black ancestors had once worked for. In his pamphlet, David Walker claimed that Thomas Jefferson was the primary architect behind America's racism towards Black people. Walker wrote, quote, "Mr. Jefferson, a much greater philosopher the world never afforded, has in truth injured us more, and has been as great a barrier to our emancipation as anything that has ever been advanced against us," close quote. To look too critically at Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, a man of reason and revolution, was unthinkable. Jefferson, more than anyone else I could think of growing up, more than Revolutionary period Bostonians such as Paul Revere or Samuel or John Adams, was the embodiment of American freedom. He was the one declaring life and liberty as inalienable rights, as endowed by our Creator. And the third inalienable right, pursuit of happiness, was a concept Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson borrowed from English philosopher John Locke, but it existed nowhere else in the world as a human right until it appeared in Jefferson's Declaration. Massachusetts' son John Adams pressed Jefferson, though Jefferson was a slave owner, to write the document on freedom. And Jefferson's slaveholding was never held against him when he authored it, nor was it when I was growing up. His critical importance as a founder transcended the inconvenient detail. Copies of David Walker's appeal were seized and destroyed, but they continued to be smuggled, carefully hidden, even sewn into clothing lining by those brave enough to carry it forth. Anyone caught with the appeal once was whipped and pilloried. If caught a second time with it, they could be killed. Laws already prohibiting teaching, reading, and writing to the enslaved were strengthened in response to this work published in Boston. As I walked down narrow, winding cobblestone streets, gazing up at red brick buildings my family knew well, my mind was staggered by the notion that my family, an African-American family called Hemmings, a family my grandmother had said worked for Thomas Jefferson, included the us that David Walker was speaking to and about. In a collection of observations entitled Notes on Virginia, meant to be distributed privately but distributed widely, Thomas Jefferson's beliefs about black people became known. These were the beliefs Walker was referring to. These beliefs had a long-lasting effect, harming multitudes of people of color across centuries all over the world, because Thomas Jefferson was one of the greatest and most influential writers in human history. And I'm quoting from Notes on Virginia. Deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites, 10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries they have sustained, new provocations, the real distinctions which nature has made, and many other circumstances will divide us into parties and produce convulsions, which will probably never end but in the extermination of the one or the other race. To these objections, which are political, may be added others, which are physical and moral. The first difference which strikes us is that of color. And is this difference of no importance? Is it not the foundation of a greater or less share of beauty in the two races? Are not the fine mixtures of red and white, the expressions of every passion by greater or less suffusions of color in the one, preferable to that eternal monotony which reigns in the countenances, that immovable veil of black which covers the emotions of the other race? Add to these flowing hair, a more elegant symmetry of form, their own judgment in favor of the whites, declared by their preference of them, as uniformly as is the preference of the orangutan for the black woman over those of his own species. Close quote. Thomas Jefferson was an early promoter of the stereotypical, quote, strong and disagreeable odor, close quote, of black people, pseudoscientifically deducing that the difference in our biology resulted in a higher tolerance to heat and cold, a secreting less by kidneys, more by skin, and the risible need for less sleep. The stereotype of hypersexualization and inferiority in reason predestined people of African descent for a life of the body and not of the mind. Jefferson conceded bravery and musical talent among the gifts, but he added, quote, whether they will be equal to the composition of a more extensive run of melody or of complicated harmony is yet to be proved, close quote. And then there was this lie, quote, among the blacks is misery enough, God knows, but no poetry, close quote. In his clumsily thought out and hastily written generalization, Jefferson proposed that black people and white people belonged to separate races. I considered that while Jefferson scribbled down personal prejudices to be taken as general truths, that our English family of servants, who he knew well from daily interactions spanning decades, who faithfully cooked and served his meals, made his clothes, emptied his bedpans, built his famous house, accompanied him on travels, brought him his paper and ink, and purportedly slept with him, were harmed with this writing, and so were their descendants. David Walker died before learning about the 1831 Nat Turner revolt that was inspired by his appeal, an event which resulted in enhanced restrictions and the punishment of black bodies throughout the South. But the appeal and Nat Turner's rebellion also led to the gathering of some men in Boston on a snowy night, January 6, 1832, in the basement of the African Baptist Church at Smith Court in the West End neighborhood my family would call home 40 years on. The African Baptist Church, also called the Meeting House, was always a black church. It was built as early as 1806 by free laborers. On that winter night, a white newspaper editor named William Lloyd Garrison, 1805 to 1879, and a group of 11 other white men co-founded the New England Anti-Slavery Society, which grew into the American Anti-Slavery Society. And after that evening, and through subsequent works of a growing number of anti-slavery societies, many black-led, Boston became associated with the radicalized approach to ending slavery, which was called immediatism, or the immediate end of slavery. William Lloyd Garrison founded a newspaper in Boston called The Liberator, which became the paper of record for abolitionists and abolitionism until the Civil War. The Liberator employed black printers and typesetters and directed a, quote, corps of Negro agents, close quote, in cities and in towns to sell subscriptions at great risk to the personal safety of all. Among white abolitionists, Garrison was perhaps the best known and also most reviled for his anti-slavery militancy. His espousal of a fully integrated society also made him unpopular among many other white abolitionists. Thomas Jefferson's daughter, Martha Randolph, a lifelong enslaver and torchbearer of her father's legacy, visited Boston in 1835, where she observed, quote, "The townspeople had a meeting here to declare their disapprobation of the conduct of the abolitionists, that the rights of the slaveholding states had been established by the nation, that they had neither the right nor the desire to interfere between them and their slaves, acknowledging at the same time their disapprobation of the principle, but doing us the justice to say that it had been forced upon us by the mother country. The House of Correction in the lunatic hospital would be the proper punishment for Garrison." Close quote. Martha's rationalization that she was powerless to do anything about mass emancipation because the institution had been forced upon the colonies by England was often put to use. Enslavers like her were stuck with the dilemma Jefferson described as the, quote, wolf by the ear, close quote. We can neither hold on to slavery nor let the wolf go. But Martha's daughter Ellen, who married a Bostonian, admitted in a letter that New England, which had managed to abolish slavery, despite its being forced upon that region by England too, surpassed the South in manufactures and technological advances using free labor. New England farmers even managed to work the region's very difficult soils and in the more difficult climate than the South's. When she was in Boston, Martha Randolph was unmoved by the presence of free people all around her, who owned their own labor and pursued happiness. It never occurred to Martha Randolph that her subjugated workforce yearned for their freedom every day of their lives. Enslavement of people of color remained interwoven in the lives of the Jefferson Randolph family as it did in the fabric of the Southern economy. In the 50 years following the Revolution that Thomas Jefferson helped ignite, ending the white slavery to Britain and opening conversations on mass emancipation of enslaved black labor, Martha Jefferson hung on to her slaves until death. A year after Martha Jefferson Randolph condemned William Lloyd Garrison, Massachusetts established that natural rights superseded the right to own slaves, that any slave brought to Massachusetts would be considered free. There was a spy network in place to monitor fugitive activity. Black stevedores who worked the wharves at Boston Harbor kept close watch on incoming and outgoing vessels, keeping an eye on arrivals from the South and those of color in service to white travelers. As I'll recount later, individuals in Boston attempted to seize a woman who was enslaved to another daughter of Martha Jefferson Randolph just as she was leaving Boston Harbor and returning to the South by sea. Her would-be helpers were unsuccessful at rescuing her, and the Jefferson Randolph family maid not only remained enslaved, but she would go on to endure a life of sexual slavery in Cuba and in Louisiana. And she was also a member of the Hemmings family, thus a probable relative of ours. Echoing Fergus M. Bordowich, author of the brilliant Bound for Canaan, his history of the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was an act of, quote, vast and profound civil disobedience, close quote, for the, quote, country's soul, close quote, and by the coalition of people of color working together with white people. Boston became the best-known home to ex-slaves or freedom seekers who were welcomed by black descendants of patriots of the Revolution, and the free choremen, barbers, domestic service workers, whalers and seamen, and the first black lawyers and judges in America, all banded together with powerful white allies to get runners to freedom. Boston's radical immediatism stood in contrast to the more common gradualist form of abolitionism, identified with Pennsylvania Quakers, Lutherans, Methodists, and other pacifist-minded faith-based communities, and of a more conservative anti-slavery organizations which demanded a bloodless and protracted transition. White abolitionists operated under various official organizations, such as the American and New England and Massachusetts anti-slavery societies and the women's-led version, the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society. They believed that slavery was the most important moral question facing the country, the one that would determine the soul of the nation going forward, even if these groups constantly argued over how and when to change the structure. Black and white abolitionists worked together, but black abolitionists often found themselves suspicious of and frustrated with the efforts of their white sympathizers, feeling not enough was being done to end the wicked institution for good. And there was an outgoing hot debate between pacifists and those who called for violent rebellion. In the 1830s and 40s, abolitionist groups in Boston tended to be segregated, and black activists found themselves shut out of meeting discussions, even about their own people. There was a problem of white prejudice towards black people, with white abolitionists deciding black people were incapable of assuming leadership positions in their own cause. There was a problem of white allies caring more about the imagined plight of the enslaved stranger living at a distance than for the freedom seekers sheltering in their own neighborhoods. There was a split along gender lines, with white feminists of New England unwilling to rally around the rights of black women. There was the ongoing problem with just how dangerous the work was. In 1837, Elijah P. Lovejoy, an anti-slavery newspaper printer, was murdered, defending his paper and his office. Throughout the history of the anti-slavery movement, black neighborhoods were targeted by mobs, homes and businesses burned down. Black and white abolitionists were assaulted and beaten by mobs and had to remain vigilant against regular death threats. In 1838, Pennsylvania Hall, built to hold meetings for abolitionists, was burned down by a white mob right after the construction was finished. There were those white abolitionists who wanted to see slavery ended in order to remove the black presence from America entirely. Racists advocated sending freed people back to Africa under the aegis of the American Colonization Society, or ACS, which raised funds through private interests and faith communities to send people to an established West African colony at Liberia, whose capital, Monrovia, was named for President James Monroe, an early backer of the ACS. The debate over the slavery question and how to end it intensified, with the South stubbornly holding on to property rights and vilifying both black and white abolitionists as enemy one to Southern business and Southern culture. The work to end slavery, to go against the way the South conducted business, was fraught with danger. Southern representation in Congress, working with Northern allies, led to the creation of the Federal Compromise of 1850, designed to hold the Union together while debate raged over whether new territories would be slave states or free states. This bill included the Fugitive Slave Law, which, among other provisions, demanded that free states comply in returning any and all fugitives to their rightful owners. By this compromise, the federal government acquiesced to the will of the South and empowered her. The law sanctioned pursuit of runaways who crossed the Mason and Dixon line dividing North and South, and defined freedom seekers as stolen property. Writer, orator, political leader, and abolitionist Frederick Douglass, 1818 to 1895, chronicled his nail-biting freedom journey in his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. His career as a powerful public speaker began in Massachusetts, and he used Boston as a base of operations for his lecture circuit, understanding he had a lot of friends there, black and white. Douglass eloquently referred to himself as a, quote, robber, close quote, under the terms of the Fugitive Slave Act, because he had stolen himself when he ran from slavery. Bostonians became more and more incensed over the South's demands that Boston supply law enforcement aid to return the freedom seekers. White Bostonians became positively enraged when federal marshals invaded the city to arrest fugitives hiding in the American Athens. When a fugitive to Boston from Virginia named Anthony Burns was placed on trial and returned to slavery under guard of federal marshals and a militarized posse, 140 men strong, Black and white Bostonians came together in the understanding that this terrible concession to the Southern slave power threw into question Boston's own identity as the haven of liberty. Fugitive episodes enraged the least confrontational and most conservative in Boston. One white Bostonian observed, quote, "We went to bed one night old-fashioned conservative compromise Union Whigs and waked up stark mad abolitionists," close quote. Bostonian and Unitarian minister Reverend Theodore Parker declared, quote, "I say there are two great laws in this country. One is the slave law. That is the law of the President of the United States. It is the law of every marshal and of every meanest ruffian. There is another law. It is the law of the people," close quote. Drawing a line between the Anthony Burns case and Boston's response to the British Stamp Act of 1765, Reverend Parker invoked Revolutionary-era rhetoric, quote, "That which is not just is not law, and that which is not law ought not to be obeyed," close quote. The Black and white Bostonians coordinated together to shelter and aid fugitives like Anthony Burns, sending them to Canada freedom using Underground Railroad networks north and west, and to defend freedom seekers in court. Massachusetts responded to the Burns case with a personal liberty law of 1855, refusing to assist Southerners in the apprehension of alleged stolen property, refusing to return people to bondage, and giving freedom seekers the right to trial and due process. One of the most celebrated names during this particularly hot period of fugitive activity and Boston's efforts to shelter runners was Lewis Hayden. My family knew Lewis Hayden and his wife Harriet, and as I would learn, they knew many other former abolitionists personally, both black and white. The Hemmings' first residence in Boston at 5 Phillips Court off Phillips Street stood right near the Hayden house at number 66. Lewis Hayden, 1811 to 1889, was a fugitive from Kentucky slavery. His first wife and child were owned and sold downriver by United States Senator Henry Clay, and he never saw them again. During the journey to Canada with his second wife Harriet, traveling by night, they dusted their faces with flour to pass as white passengers. Sheltering runners ramped up for the Haydens in the days after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, whose restrictions saw not what was intended, a cessation of fugitive activity, but rather an increase in the numbers of runners. Lewis and Harriet Hayden regularly hid, fed, and clothed scores of people passing through Boston. 1853 saw the couple playing host to some 13 people at one time. Lewis Hayden's dedication led him to shoot and kill a deputy U.S. Marshal charged with sending Anthony Burns back to slavery. After first being returned to enslavement, Burns was at long last delivered to freedom, and he died free in Canada. The Haydens were directly involved in the emancipation of Shadrach Minkins, the first case tried under the Fugitive Slave Law, and a man for whom President Millard Fillmore called in federal troops to arrest, but who reached freedom's line in Montreal with the aid of his Boston friends. The Boston Vigilance Committee, of which Lewis Hayden was officer, involved a team of heavyweights like Frederick Douglass, who with Harriet Tubman remains perhaps the most iconic figure in all anti-slavery history. Committees included sympathetic whites, too, like Richard Henry Dana Jr., lawyer, who also represented Anthony Burns, and who was the best-selling author of 2 Years Before the Mast, which the 49ers carried with them as one of the few available travel guides on California on their way out to the goldfields. And there were members of the Secret Six, like Reverend Theodore Parker and Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who would help finance the radical abolitionist John Brown's revolt at Harper's Ferry, which pushed the nation closer to war. Boston's vigilance committees followed a higher law than that of the American Congress. The Boston they wanted, realized, came from a sense of shared destiny given by this higher law, quote, "If the servant escape from his master, he shall dwell with thee in the city that liketh him best," close quote, which was Boston. I had learned nothing about any of this when I was in school, or of the many courageous actors, black and white, whom my unknown ancestors knew personally. Fleeing Virginia, where their relatives and ancestors were enslaved for generations, the Hemmingses chose Boston over Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and New York to live in freedom. because Boston was their city of hope.